Hello everyone, good evening. It's great to see you all. Thank you for coming here today. As some of you already know, my name is Banu Aydınoğlu'gil and I run the Heritage Program here at Newington Green Meeting House. We have run the Heritage Program for the last 3.5 years, thanks to generous funds of the National Heritage Lottery Fund. Today we are here for the opening of one of the last exhibitions of our heritage project, The Legacy of Slavery, Abolitionism and History of Newington Green Meeting House. And we have an amazing panel to discuss Black British history and the role of Meeting House in history of slavery and abolitionism. Thank you, Joanna, Ken, David, and Simon for being here. So throughout the summer, Heritage team members, David, Mercedes, and I had an extensive discussion about carrying out a final in-house exhibition towards the end of the Heritage Project. During these discussions, we concluded that throughout the Heritage Project, much of the emphasis has been on the legacy of Mary Wollstonecraft and Richard Price, and there is a lack of Black British history within this legacy. And with this understanding, Heritage team has started an archival and desktop research project to understand the history of the abolitionist movement and role of slavery in the foundation years of the Meeting House. And this exhibition that you will see is the end result of these discussions and research. During our discussions, we knew that the money from the slavery business went into industrial development in Britain, and huge amount of the money is suddenly being released into the British economy with compensation given to the slave owners. And we were aware that this is the basis of capitalism. So there is a great database, as some of you might know, and a research at UCL exploring the capitalism and slavery's symbiotic relationship, and the compensation records research started about 10 years ago. It's a great source, we utilize from it, and if you want to check it out, it's on the UCL's website. With this understanding of the 18th and 19th centuries, we knew there is probably no economic benefit independent from this relationship. So when exploring the history of the Meeting House and the lives of abolitionists, we try to be as reflective as possible and consider this context. So it's only a start to open up these discussions and encourage research around the topic. And we hope that this will develop into further research about Black history and history of the Meeting House. Lastly, as I said, this is one of the last projects of the Heritage Fund, which is ending at the end of December. And I would like to use this opportunity to thank everyone in the Heritage Project. I would like to thank our Minister, C.J. McGregor, New Unity's Chair, Sue Morrison, and our General Manager, Nick Toner, for their support of the Heritage Project. And big thank you to the Heritage team members, Mercedes Mendy, David Walter, for their invaluable research that they produce and all the interesting discussions we had throughout the summer. And David Bidwell for his amazing work at the Meeting House. Thank you, David. Thanks to Ender, our AV support, and for his professionalism. And Ella, she can't be here, but Ella brought hers for the incredible visual materials that she produced and her encouragement to us throughout the project. Again, I just want to thank, last but not the least, all our panelists here, Ken Olande, David Walter, Simon Strickling-Scott, and Joanna Barrett. Joanna Barrett will be facilitating this discussion. Again, thank you all for being here, and I would like to pass the microphone to the exhibition's curator, main curator, Mercedes Mendy.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming tonight. My name is Mercedes, and I'm the Heritage Project Support Officer here at Newington Green Meeting House. I've co-curated this exhibition with lots of fantastic help and support from David Walter and Banu. As some of you probably have heard, many heritage spaces and cultural institutions are unearthing and exploring their links to slavery and colonialism, some of which has been spurred on by the BLM movement and the tearing down of the Edward Colston statue, an MP and founder of the Royal African Company. This entails going through a process of reflection and creating new dialogues and/or re-evaluating and assessing previously discussed ideas, all of which contribute to the reimagining of the world we live in now. As with many other heritage spaces and cultural organisations, myself and the heritage team began to think about how we can share the history of Newington Green Meeting House and continue its legacy. We thought about how we can continue to make Newington Green Meeting House a relevant and inclusive space. Newington Green Meeting House is a place of dissent and where radical ideas blossomed and developed, but as with many other heritage spaces built in the 18th century, it would have been hard to ignore the political, cultural and socio-economic ongoings at the time, which would have included and largely been influenced by the slave trade. As you will see in this exhibition, we have explored some of the links Newington Green Meeting House had to the transatlantic slave trade through the trade of African people and the abolitionist movement. We have also attempted to highlight that there was a black presence in England and worldwide before the 18th century, and that there has always been a black presence here, and that British colonialism has helped shape and define ways of thinking and behaving. Although we've only just touched the surface on Newington Green Meeting House and its surrounding areas and what was going on during this period in regard to the slave trade and abolitionism, we hope that it has the potential to be explored further. Myself and the heritage team believe that it's important to understand, acknowledge and share what we've found, but also to highlight that historical truths don't always have to be frowning and can be seen as a proud moment. In this particular case, we have attempted to confront history and explore how Newington Green Meeting House can be remembered in this context. So thanks to Banner and David Walls for all their help and support, the team at New Unity, chairs and trustees, CJ McGregor, Nick Toner, Simon Strickland, Joanna Barrett, Ken Olendi, Ella Broadhurst, who isn't here today, David Bidwell for all the amazing work he does, and Enda. Thanks again for coming. We really appreciate it, and we hope you find it just as interesting and as enlightening as we did for researching for this exhibition. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Johanna and I'm delighted to be able to be here to facilitate this discussion using the expertise and knowledge of our three speakers. So we're aiming to get an idea of the bigger picture and the context for exploring British Black history and how the stories of other underrepresented groups such as women and the Irish intersect with this history, and how people locally played their part in trying to rid Britain of an appalling practice that continues to leave a legacy today. At the end, we hope to have a better understanding of some of the issues and be able to better appreciate the wonderful exhibition that is awaiting us upstairs at about 8 o'clock-ish, we think. This will work with each of the speakers being invited to answer a question, and for our other panelists then to address that topic with a question or comment. And we will end with a question and answer where we allow the discussion to broaden out. So any comments or thoughts you have, if you need to make a note to hold those for the end, that would be really lovely. So I'll just briefly introduce our speakers first. We've got Ken Olendi here. He's a former tutor and journalist with extensive experience of reviewing literature about Black and British history. He's also a lecturer on race, African history. He's currently completing a PhD at Brighton University on race and the current crisis. We have David Walter. He's a long-time Hackney resident with a degree in history and international relations, and he's currently archiving records and artefacts from the Meeting House for storage in the CLR James Library over in Dalston. He's also a blog writer and was a recent participant in the Meeting House's Festival of Dissent. And we have Simon Strickland Scott, also a blog writer and member of the congregation here, as well as a full-time carer. Other careers have included lecturing, following his PhD in sociology, and he also worked for many years for London Underground, where he was a union rep for the RMT. So we have a great panel here. So I'll turn to my first panelist, Ken. Now, I'd like us to get a sense of the big picture or larger context. And I know you're currently running a course here called Black in Britain, A Long Vibrant History, which I'd really recommend. I was a teacher for many years in the primary and secondary sectors, and I was interested to note that recently the footballer Troy Deeney commissioned a survey in 2022 in which he asked teachers in England about the teaching of black history in schools. The results shocked him. More than 2/3 said they did not feel empowered to teach black history, and most felt the curriculum was racially biased. So my question to you, Ken, is how well informed do you feel the British public is with regard to the history of black British people, and why should it matter?
Unfortunately, the answer to that, I think, is that they're not very, is the answer to how informed people are. And I think it matters. I'm going to come back and do a bit more than this. I think it matters because if people don't know about this history, it makes it easier to have a view that says, for instance, there is a long civilized tradition of the way British people have behaved, and then lazy or stupid or whatever people from elsewhere come here and they lower the standards. This is something which I think we've seen recently around refugees and the protests at refugee hostels, where there's a whole series of arguments that refugees who arrive are all, to quote some of the people on protests, either rapists or people who are just here to come on benefits. And this suggests a lack of education about what's going on in the world and what Britain's part in it is. So just to come back to what is important about that history, I think that there's a whole series of things that people don't know. One thing I would say is there's been a row recently. Mercedes mentioned Black Lives Matter and what a change that made, and it led to real anger because, for instance, it led to the National Trust starting to put on leaflets about homes that people were going to visit, about where the money came from that built those homes. So people who went out for a weekend to look at nice furniture and paintings might see, usually in small print at the bottom, by the way, the money that made all these nice things came from the slave trade. And there was a lot of unhappiness, particularly in certain papers, the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph and so on, about this, saying it was outrageous and it was playing with history. But it seems to me that it actually is saying something about how Britain became the country it is. And as far as I can tell, it was about 1/3 of National Trust properties have not all their money, but some connection with the slave trade at some point. So that's important, and I think people don't realise sometimes quite how long the connection is with black people. The first concrete record we have of black people in Britain is on Hadrian's Wall. There is a memorial to the head of a group of Moorish troops, so they're from North Africa, who is commemorated there. So that's going back to roughly 200. I have a problem with years. I'll say AD has a general thing about exactly that period. And that there were people, for instance, in Ipswich, they found a graveyard from the 13th century, which has, looking at the bodies, 9 of the people buried in the graveyard are sub-Saharan Africans. No one knows any more than that. They just found the bodies, but people were here. By the time you get to the Tudor period, you actually have people who were involved in all sorts of sections of society. Not all of them, I mean, some of them were enslaved, but most of them weren't. There is a very famous in some circles letter that Queen Elizabeth I put out that said there are too many people of this kind, meaning black people, in Britain, and saying that some should be removed. The actual instruction was for 10 people to be removed, which seems a bit of an extreme reaction for the Queen to write a letter about removing 10 people, but I shall let that pass. It says that it was an issue, and I think that what's happened through the decades is, through the centuries, is you actually lose track of all sorts of relationships. So the idea about this may seem like, I think that through the slave trade, you lost track of a relationship with Africa. So people do not realise, and to this day I think people do not realise, that Africa was a place where you had a series of empires across Western Africa with cities and urban civilisations. You have some evidence of this. For instance, the Benin bronzes, which are in the British Museum at the moment, were looted in Victorian Britain when that area was conquered by British troops, and it shows that there was that civilization there. But there was an idea that no such civilizations existed, that Africans were simply people who lived in mud huts, and that there was no other such civilization. Indeed, Victorian anthropologists had to invent a race called the Hamites, because as explorers went around Africa, they kept finding the ruins of cities. And they said, well, Africans can't have made these because, frankly, Africans are all stupid. So who made them? So they invented a group of people called the Hamites who'd disappeared, but had made these fantastic cities because Africans couldn't have done it. Now that seems an awful lot of effort to go to deny Africans the ability to have made cities and so on. I think those kinds of things are important. I think people have lost the reality of what slavery did. The fact that Atlantic slavery, we'll be discussing this, I'm sure other people will bring it up, was different from earlier forms of slavery. And the dehumanization involved in saying that all black people were inferior and deserved nothing more than being enslaved is something which to this day has not really been finished. We've also lost, and I really want to finish on this, the legacy of people coming together to fight back. And hopefully that's what we'll be talking about today, because I believe often people will say, oh yes, well you had the slave trade, but everyone believed that African people were subhuman in those days. And when you look at the history, you'll find that there were large groups of people who didn't believe that there was always a challenge around it. So for those reasons, I think it's really important that we have an idea about these things and we bring this history back and the people who were involved in it. I'll stop it.
That's lovely. Thank you, Ken. Have we got any thoughts or comments from the other panellists? David?
I concur with Ken. It also shows that the expansion of the British Empire from its earliest inception also created a template for modern governance that actually was a blur and also a clear line between race, gender, sexuality and class. And I give an example of Joanna Vassar Bromley, who was the daughter of Olaudah Equiano, who a self-emancipated African man who became middle class. But he was also fully aware that he could be enslaved at any moment if he went to particular parts of England. His second only living daughter was a mixed race, but became a middle-class wife to Reverend Henry Bromley. This also has to be understood that there's a progressive connections between English people and people who were seen by the powers that be as being inferior, actually formed close relationships with each other. So it's quite a complex. When you look at the situation that was going on in the Caribbean and in Africa and in Asia, in this country it was quite a complex relationship between the descendants of those who were oppressed or enslaved or indentured and those who basically, through the virtue of being male and born into wealthy families and therefore could have access to the wealth that was generated by the slave trade, were happy to marry people who, if they were working class, would be seen as inferior. So Joanna Vassar Bromley is a microcosm of that complexity within what was happening in England and also in places in Asia and in Africa and in the Caribbean and also in the United States as well, and Latin America as well.
Thank you, Simon. Do you agree that it was a complex picture here?
Yes, there's a couple of things I'd like to pick up with from what Ken said. In terms of awareness, I'd like to talk about graffiti, because the unknown person who sprayed "was a racist" on the plinth of Churchill's statue during the Black Lives Matter protests triggered a national debate. I think people were a bit stunned. Churchill, a racist? Really? Impossible, surely not. And most serious newspapers actually had to engage with that and had to discuss, was Churchill a racist? And I think even the Telegraph had to admit, ultimately, well, yeah, he was. But I think that got an awful lot of people thinking for the first time about who has been called the greatest Briton ever to live. And actually, his reputation is seen in a more balanced way there. So kudos to that graffiti artist, because it took that direct action to start that debate. Yeah, I'd also like to talk about, just briefly, when you discussed the early inhabitants of this island, and many of them were black. I mean, it's not confirmed, but we could go back to Cheddar Man. 10,000 years ago, 76% chance that he was black or brown. And he lived in my home county of Somerset, which is very white, but it's quite astonishing, actually. So there was Cheddar Man. Also, the Museum of London began to look at their skeleton collection a few years ago, and it's one of the most extensive skeleton collections in Britain. And they thought, we'll see what DNA we can extract here. And they took the first 4 skeletons, and they were all from Roman London, Londinium. 2 of the 4 were African. Now, I'm not suggesting that's a representative sample, but from that small sample, the conclusion had to be London has, from its very inception, always been a multicultural, multi-ethnic city. So I think that's just to complement what you were saying about Ipswich, really.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to say in response, Ken?
Really, it's just a matter of, I suppose, agreeing again with what the people have said. I mean, one of the things about gender and sexuality, partly because I was doing some research on it recently, when Uganda has recently passed a law which calls for the death penalty for aggravated homosexuality, as they call it. And there's a big thing that this is something, a decadence that was brought in by Westerners. But the interesting thing to me is that these laws, which goes with what David was saying, were things which were brought in by the British when they took over, and people now look back and say, this is traditional African thought, but it's not really traditional African thought. It's thought that goes back to the Victorian period, and it comes from a law that was introduced initially in India, just after the Indian uprising, as part of a way of controlling people. And yes, the thing about particularly Romans, the only thing I would say about Romans and black Roman women is their class position, which I think is interesting. People often think that people like that must have been right at the bottom of society, but at least 2 people of those skeletons that were found in wealthy graves. There was no particular connection in this cosmopolitan Roman Empire between being poor and being black. So just to mention too, there's Beachy Head lady, who's a skeleton that was found by Beachy Head, was a wealthy grave, and in York, as a woman who's known as Ivory Bangle Lady, because for years she had an ivory bangle and a jet bangle together in the grave. And again, when they started doing studies, they found that both these women were sub-Saharan Africans.
So we're looking at, as you said, a very long and complex history of a black and African often presence in Britain. One of the arguments that has been used against having a British black curriculum is that it might dilute our sense of Britishness, which, given everything we've heard so far, seems it's felt ridiculous the first time I heard it, and it feels even more ridiculous now, because clearly being British and Black British are inextricably linked. We also know, we've mentioned empire, and we know the impact that had on the project, really, to enslave and have this dehumanising Atlantic slave trade. So would you like to talk to us? My question is, how would you describe the impact of slavery and its legacy on other groups, David?
The history of anti-slavery and slavery in the British Empire from a modern context started in the bloody era of the English Civil War from 1642 to 1655, and the spread of Presbyterianism, a localized form of non-conformist government during that period, had become hierarchies that shaped the identities of the imperial and post-imperial worlds, and paradoxically influenced the political nature of the different anti-colonial, socio-political and revolutionary movements that acted against the colonial entitlements and impunities that affected the social lives and duties of many people across the 7 continents. For most of the early 17th century, England, Europe's first modern parliamentary republic, became a globalized and destructive hierarchical template that determined the social order that affected the sexual and biological values of every man, woman, and child in the world to this day. The divine rights of kings to rule absolutely was much more complex for some modernizing female monarchs and other classes of women within the 18th century world, especially in British society. The post-Atlantic slave trade period continued to develop economic, sexual, and racial impunity, entitlements, and segregations, which had created a lineage of strange legacies and a continuity of brutal consequences that had created a striated global tyranny against pre-colonial and industrialized communities alike around the world. But women and their descendants had different experiences directly and indirectly from the African slave trade in the West and the East. While the elite were mostly made of wealthy British men who by law were guaranteed their wealth from birth because of their gender, women, especially middle-class women, were prohibited from inheriting their wealth in their own right and only had legal standing as widows or close relatives to the deceased. For working poor white women or women of color who were enslaved or criminalized, they were transported, enslaved, or indentured across the imperial world. Middle-class women who traveled by necessity or choice, looking for new lives and new opportunities, found themselves, as did the female working class, at a crossroads where race, class, gender, and sexual lines intersected in destructive or radically progressive ways. The different imperial powers also had different experiences of the African slave trade in the West and the East. Peter the Great, considered a modernizing monarch, had abolished slavery in the Russian Empire in 1723. Imperial Russia's connection to the African slave trade, because of its geography, was a very indirect one. Abraham Petrovich Gannibal, an enslaved East African boy captured by the Ottomans, one of the last great Islamic empires to trade in enslaved peoples, became a celebrated soldier and military engineer, whose grandson, Alexander Pushkin, being aware of his African ancestry, became equally celebrated as one of Russia's greatest authors. In the context of the early modern republican beginnings of the British Empire, Irish Catholic dissidents were transported out of Ireland as indentured labour or servants to the British colonial plantations of Barbados and later in Jamaica under extremely punitive and restrictive laws designed to prevent Irish dissidents and enslaved Africans from undermining or overthrowing the power of the English plantocracy. Samuel Boddington, a merchant and a pro-slavery advocate whose family had been involved in the international slave trade for 3 generations, was also a dissenter, as all merchants living in the non-conformist community of Stoke Newington were. The establishment of the British monarchy in 1660 allowed Charles II to found and invest in the Royal African Company, which he chartered in 1672. Merchants in Hackney, such as Sir John Casland, had become directors and investors in different companies such as the South Sea Company, which traded in enslaved people with other empires such as the Spanish Empire. The Royal African Company represented how a highly mercantile and aggressive global power from the West gave rise to capitalism, an economic system that was opposed to the social power of women or people of color having any autonomy over their own lives, but created a destructive hierarchy based on divisions of class, race, gender, and sexuality. The Newington Green Meeting House, for most of the 18th century, became a microcosm, in effect a petri dish, of the political realities and the awareness of the paradoxes that affected the different degrees of race, class, gender, and sexuality across the colonized world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Ken, anything you'd like to question him about or comment on?
Well, I'd certainly like to comment. I mean, I think it's fascinating, one of the things, talking, for instance, about the treatment of Irish and other people, was the degree to which there was actually quite a lot of working together between the people like the Irish and Africans who'd been taken to the Caribbean and the Americas. And one of the things that the planters did was start actively trying to say, you people aren't the same. You think you're the same. You're working together. You might be getting married, but we're going to start treating you differently. And this was part of the dehumanizing of the Africans. They've started saying to the indentured people, no, you're better than they are. Keep apart from them, trying to separate them. And I think that the comings together and keepings apart are very interesting. I'd just like to mention one of the things. There was an 18th century magistrate in London, a guy called John Fielding, who was very angry about the fact that when enslaved people escaped and got into London, they were very hard to recapture, as he said, because they get the mob on their side. And I think that this is interesting that a lot of people identified with each other. And just the other thing, I'd like to ask a bit about people like James Africanus Horton, who people, it's a long story, but basically at a time when it was very difficult for white people to go to West Africa for health issues, because they tended to die, the British Empire decided to train up Africans. So they trained up as a leading doctor and leading naval officer a guy called James Horton. He added the name Africanus because he was so annoyed with the fact that people kept not mentioning the fact that he was a black African. And people like him, he wanted to be part of the empire. He was saying, look, I'm as good as everyone else, let me be part, and they wouldn't allow it. So I suppose my question would be, what about the contradictions in people like him? That's, I think,
Like I mentioned, I mean, it all depended on what the British Empire needed at the time. So we have to remember that it was an imperial world, and I give an example, the Great Game between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. And this led to the formation of the British Indian regiments, which ironically were a multicultural force. I mean, they weren't all Hindus, they weren't all Muslims. Most of them came from Nepal, came from Bengal. Most of them had many different languages and many different beliefs. Some even had the Zoroastrian beliefs. But the British managed to train them to the same standard, because they couldn't have, well, from the experience of what was called the Indian Mutiny, they needed an Indian army that could sing from the same song sheet as the British military. So it was not an accident that instead of getting rid of the Indian cavalry that came from the principalities in India, they trained them as cavalry units. And so it was not unusual to see Indian cavalry units in the First World War, or infantry units in the First World War. About 8 million Indian soldiers died on the front line. That was one of the largest colonial forces to die in Europe at the time. The other high casualty rates was African porters in the war between Germany and England in Southwest Africa. And within those high casualty rates, most of the African men and Asian men joined because it was a way to make money when they couldn't make any money as farmers. It was an adventure, especially if they were young men. They heard about what was going on around in the rest of the world, so it was also an opportunity for them to advance up the ranks, and when they come home, they could use that rank to become to get into the middle class, which gave them the opportunity to get their children educated in the missionary schools, so that they would eventually work in the colonial offices in the colonized world. So I give an example. Mahatma Gandhi was trained in a missionary school, and he got trained as a lawyer in one of the British universities. And also Nehru, who has his name in the rolls as a lawyer. I can't remember, it's in Holborn somewhere. Yeah, so he's registered. So most of the leadership, the reason why you had the independence movements was that these elite groups that developed, these middle class black and Asian or African and Asian groups that wanted to become prime ministers, wanted to take over the running of the country, couldn't, because ironically they were seen as inferior to the leadership of whites who ran the colonies. And then that's where you started to see the independence movements and then the independence wars as well. It didn't just happen in England, it also happened in France. Ho Chi Minh was educated as a lawyer in France, but when he realized that there was a limit to what he could do in his own country, Vietnam, he became a communist, and he led the independence movements against the French and then the Americans as well. So it's quite complex, because we get this from a Marxist point of view. They seem to have ignored the class aspects of the rise of these middle class African and Asian people, and they never really tried to reconcile that with the independence movement. That's all I have to say, because it's quite complicated. There's a lot to
essentially
think about.
That people were trying to rise up the ranks within the systems that they were in, and the empire was very good at manipulating that for its own reasons. Simon?
Yeah, I'll come back to class and the anti-slavery movement in a bit. But you also mentioned gender. Again, in my blurb later, I'll be mentioning local connections to the 1840 Anti-Slavery Convention, which was held here in London. This is a convention that was famous because there was a big debate about whether or not women should actually be allowed in the room, let alone anything else. And in the end, they compromised and let women attend, but they weren't allowed to speak. And that led to American women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, going back to the United States, well miffed, understandably. 8 years later, they organised the Seneca Falls Conference that is considered the birthplace of the women's suffrage movement. That's quite well known, but a similar process happened in Britain as a result of the exclusion of women within the anti-slavery movement. And this is people who are meant to be progressive when it comes to anti-slavery, but aren't progressive when it comes to gender. But in Britain, a lot of women who were involved in ladies' emancipation societies, those societies evolved into the early suffrage societies. So we've got an organic connection linking the anti-slavery movement with the women's movement. And indeed, if I had time, I would talk about the RSPCA, I'd talk about the NSPCC, and numerous other groups that, genealogically speaking, can trace its roots back to the anti-slavery movement. It was the first campaign of its kind in modern Britain, and it provided a template for numerous campaigns, some of which were linked directly, others occurred independently. But that's quite a momentous thing, actually, a momentous point in history where the struggle against slavery triggered multiple other movements that we're still seeing today.
Thank you. I was also particularly interested, being of Irish descent myself, this idea that there was this divide and rule going on, so people were coming together in similar oppressed circumstances, if you like, and then being discouraged from that. I thought that was quite interesting. I recently attended, Simon, an event at St James's Piccadilly, and it was to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the baptism of Ottobah Kugwano. And there was a discussion between the Booker Prize winning Nigerian-British writer, Ben Okri, and the curator of the Hayward Gallery show, which was called In the Black Fantastic, Echo Eshen. They said Kugwano's huge achievement was that he transcended his condition and that he became the freest man in England because he wrote about and insisted on the oneness of humanity and the power of words. We know he wrote as a philosopher in 1787, before Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Men in 1790, and of Woman in 1792. And we know he published a shorter edition for the Sons of Africa in 1791. I had a chat afterwards with the very gracious Ben Okri, and I said, do you think Mary Wollstonecraft would have read this work? And he said, I'd like to think she did. We also do know that he reviewed Ekwano's autobiography, that she reviewed it for Joseph Johnson's Analytical Review magazine. So I think it's very possible that, as you were saying, there were links between anti-slavery movements and other movements. We know that the first black African priest, and we've talked about the missionaries, to be ordained in the Church of England, Philip Kwakwe, was baptised down the road at St Mary's, Islington in 1759. And we also know that the first black African bishop of Nigeria, Samuel Ajayi Crowther, came to study there in 1826. So we know, as we said earlier, there has been a black presence and a strong black presence in lots of ways in London for a long time. My question is, how would you describe the fight against slavery locally?
Yeah, just picking up on that Ekwano's daughter, Joanna Vassa, who's been mentioned already, is still in Stoke Newington. She's actually buried in Abney Park. So that connection from Mary Wollstonecraft through Ekwano through to Joanna Vassa, there's a kind of circle there. Most people involved interested in the anti-slavery movement will be familiar with the Clapham sect, the famous group of Christian evangelicals who literally congregated around Holy Trinity Church on Clapham Common. They campaigned on a range of social issues, most notably that of the abolition of slavery. The group included William Wilberforce, the Venn family, Hannah More, and other notable abolitionists. Less well known is that Stoke Newington, which, like Clapham, was still a village at the time, also had a strong abolitionist community. In the late 18th, early 19th century, Stoke Newington was a particularly desirable place to live. Later on mentioned Paradise Row, which was considered to be the most desirable location in the whole of North London at the time. At the same time, political activity was largely the reserve of the better off. In 1800, a labourer typically worked a 6-day, 60-hour week, so had little time or energy for much else than personal survival. Thus, as we shall see, the anti-slavery movement was populated by men who were industrialists, bankers, ministers and lawyers, along with women from similar social classes. From the time of the Restoration, Stoke Newington had gained a reputation for radical nonconformity, of which this church is a legacy. And so, several generations later, that tradition would be manifested in local opposition to the slave trade. Anna Barbauld, wife of Rougemont Barbauld, a minister in this chapel, was a radical poet and writer who supported the abolitionist cause. She was a member of the Blue Stocking Society, which was a strictly non-political discussion circle. But there she would have met fellow Blue Stocking and abolitionist Hannah More. In pursuit of the anti-slavery cause, Anna wrote Epistle to William Wilberforce Esquire, a poem dedicated to the campaigning MP after the failure of his 1791 bill to abolish the slave trade. Anna lived in Stoke Newington Church Street, in what is today the Green Room Florists and Cafe. There's a brown plaque to the right of the main entrance. It is also worth noting that Anna Barbauld's niece, Lucy Aitken, who spent part of her later life in Stoke Newington, but grew up in Warrington, was a member of the Liverpool-based Roscoe Circle, a radical philosophical club with an overlapping membership with that city's Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Across the road and down the street from Anna was the much grander Fleetwood House, where the fire station now stands. The grounds of Fleetwood House are now incorporated into Abney Park, but at one time in those grounds could be found an annex called Summer House. This was the home of James Stephen, who, despite living in Stoke Newington, was a member of the aforementioned Clapham sect. Stephen's second wife was William Wilberforce's sister, Sarah. Such intermarriage amongst abolitionist families was very common. Stephen was a lawyer and a member of Parliament, and therefore well placed to make his unique contribution to the abolitionist cause, for it was he who composed the legislation for the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which formally banned the trade in the British Empire. As in life, James Stephen and Anna Barbauld still reside near each other, as both were buried in St Mary's Old Church graveyard. Among the nonconformist communities in Newington Green and Stoke Newington area, the Quakers were especially prominent. 3 local Quakers had been involved in founding the London Abolition Committee in 1787, which later grew into the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which became the preeminent movement in the campaign. William Allen, Samuel Hoare, and Joseph Woods all lived in or in close proximity to Church Street. William Allen was a renowned chemist, a teacher and horticulturalist. He ran a pharmacy in the City of London, which became the foundation for Allen and Hanbury's, now part of GlaxoSmithKline. He was a member of several learned societies and an accomplished lecturer. Allen's connections to Stoke Newington were many. He lived in Paradise Row. The location of this is now the stretch of Church Street opposite Clissold Park. Allen pioneered the use of allotments to alleviate poverty in a project that was based in Lordship Road and was visited by an approving William Wilberforce, his ally in the anti-slavery cause. As I have said, Allen was also a teacher and taught at Susanna Corder's famous Quaker Girls' School, which was located in Fleetwood House. Allen is buried in the Quaker burial ground, which lies largely hidden just off Church Street between Lordship Road and Yokeley Road. Samuel Hoare was born in Stoke Newington and, like Allen, also lived in Paradise Row. Indeed, it was Samuel Hoare's son, Jonathan, who bought a large tract of land opposite their house and turned it into the Clissold House estate. The original name was Paradise House. Hoare became a banker, and through a complicated process of mergers and partnerships, typically with other Quaker banking families, his banking business would help to spawn 2 of the largest banks we have in Britain today, Lloyds and Barclays. Samuel Hoare's daughter, Mary, married Joseph Woods, the third Stoke Newington Quaker to be involved in the Abolition Committee. Lesser known than his father-in-law or William Allen, Joseph is better known today as the father of the architect Joseph Woods the Younger. A generation later, Stoke Newington remained a centre of abolitionism. The slave trade had been abolished in Britain and the Empire in 1807. Slavery was also banned in those territories in 1834. There remained the need to ban both in the rest of the world. And so in 1839, the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society was formed. The treasurer of this organisation was George William Alexander. Appropriately, he was a financier by profession, also a Quaker, and you've probably guessed it by now, yet another resident of Paradise Row in Stoke Newington. The most well-known event organised by the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society was the 1840 London Anti-Slavery Convention that I mentioned briefly before. Alexander attended and is duly depicted in the famous painting of the conference by Benjamin Haydon. Chairing several sessions of the convention was another local resident, Thomas Binney, who lived in Upper Clapton and is buried in Abney Park. Given the important contributions of the large number of abolitionists who lived in and around the local area, and I have only mentioned the most notable, there are many others, I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that in terms of hosting a significant anti-slavery network, that Stoke Newington could be regarded as the second Clapham. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I grew up around Clapham and I didn't know this, so it just goes to show all that I'm learning. I'm sure the rest of us are feeling very well informed as well. Any comments or questions for...
Well, I think one thing I'd like to comment on is the religious ideas and how they are involved in a lot of these things, because I think it's fascinating how on the one hand we've talked about Protestantism and after the English Revolution, Cromwell coming to power, and as David was explaining, being involved in setting up the beginnings of the British Empire and a lot of these things. And on the other hand, you have a lot of dissenting people who were absolutely central in talking about equality. And I think it's one of the issues that comes up through the period, 1649 and all this period, that you have both these things coming together, most famously, though not that famously, I suppose in the Putney debates when people were talking about the idea of democracy and some of the first ideas about whether ordinary people should have a say in things. But I suppose moving aside from those different ideas, and one of the things that Cromwell first wanted to do was get rid of the radicals in the army, that there were all sorts of the people who were known as the agitators, which is where the word comes from, and he sent them off to attack people first in Ireland and then in the Caribbean, and which I think is interesting, brutalising people to stop them having these radical ideas. But as well as that, with the Restoration, you had, I'm forgetting my act, I think it's the Act of Uniformity, that's because you'd had churches springing up all over the place that said, we want radical change, we want different things, and the Act of Uniformity said you will follow one prayer book, you will follow one thing, and no one is allowed to preach anything else within 5 miles of central London. And people may know that if you go 5 miles from central London in this direction, you arrive in Stoke Newington. And that is why you have all these radicals who weren't allowed to say anything closer. And I think that is an interesting thing. But it's also interesting that you have divisions, for instance, within Quakerism between some of the best radicals and also some people who were early slave owners and so on, as people have talked about. So I think it's fascinating.
Very much. David?
What's interesting is that a man called Frederick Douglass also knew about the conference. And what's interesting about him, I think, not only was he a self-emancipated African American, but he was also steeped in the politics of the post-Civil War era of Reconstruction, and we begin to see the striation between the needs of African women, of newly emancipated African American women, and also the needs of middle-class white women. And the controversy comes when you begin to see men from the Mediterranean and from Ireland who are Catholic migrating into the post-Civil War country of the United States. And they resented this because they felt that why should men who are of lower class be able to get better treatment than middle-class white women who are being born in America? So that's, and then unfortunately this court of descended into racist organizations that had connections with the Ku Klux Klan. But for black women around the imperial world, there's a phrase that black women are the most disrespected group in the world. And we see this with how Sojourner Truth was treated when she wasn't told that there was a women's meeting going on, and she had to pack up her umbrella and her bag and literally travel there. And the famous Ain't I a Woman is one of the most famous, well, it's attributed to her, but at that time nobody recorded what she said, but that's one of her most iconic phrases. The irony that the difference between the United States and England is that even though you had middle-class women like biracial women like Joanna Vassar-Bromley, the fact that the British Empire, the awareness of black people was fundamentally on a peripheral awareness, because there wasn't a very large black population in England at the time, and there was times when they tried to deport the black poor, the black working class at that time. But in the United States of America, where you had white landowners who were living and were aware of free-born African Americans and enslaved Americans who produced the cotton that people in the north of England used to produce the goods in the factories, it's ironically become, this awareness has unfortunately sustained the resentment of marginalized middle class groups within the white populations, and also the long struggle that eventually gave rise to the civil rights movement within the African American community, which also gave a rise to marginalized groups that wanted the same rights, such as groups of indigenous Americans who ironically were becoming a middle class, a rising middle class society within America. So this shows that despite the fact that this was a predominantly white area, there was an awareness of the black presence, and they even managed, in a rare occasion, to marry other people who weren't completely white. And that was within the non-conformist community at the time. I hope that satisfies you.
So I suppose we're saying that fortunately for us,
yes,
and the act of uniformity,
yeah,
we had this seedbed, which wasn't intended, of dissent and radicalism that did have its conflicts within itself, but ultimately, I do have a thought about the fact that, for example, when I was studying American Studies, I had an optional module, Black Americans, etc. But up to that point, I can guarantee you, in my whole education, I had never had any teaching about the presence of black or African peoples in Britain. And in fact, my only teaching probably was to do with slavery. And watching the Troy programme, as I did, when it talked about, well, why don't we have a British black curriculum? I would have found that extremely useful because it's part of my heritage, because I've grown up in Britain, so it's part of everyone's heritage, is how I feel. But it is very complex, and it's nice to know that we do have a bit of a tradition here in Stoke Newington and at the Meeting House. I'd like to invite anybody. We're going to have a roving Banu with a microphone. If anyone would like to ask any of the panel any question or even comment on anything you've heard or how it's affected you, that would be lovely.
Hello, thank you. I really enjoyed your discussion, but I was wondering whether any of you knew anything in more detail about the role that this particular chapel played in the anti-slavery or the anti-racist movement. Have you uncovered anything there in your research?
Yeah, one of the things that we cover in our research is that Mary Wollstonecraft worked for, as part of her career as a writer, she worked for Joseph Johnson, and one of her jobs was to review the autobiography of Oluwadu Equiano in his magazine, Analytical Review, which was a magazine for dissenters who wanted to air their ideas and their theories across many different subjects, from history to science to politics to abolitionism, anthropology, and to raise questions. And anything could be said in that magazine as well. I'm not aware of any black presence, a direct presence within the Meeting House, but there was obviously awareness for economic and class reasons and for abolitionist reasons that black people were in the country, and that there were people that this country was trading in African people in Africa, and also supporting the plantations in the Caribbean as well.
Thank you all for your very interesting presentations. I'm interested in how we remember and how we forget cyclically. There's one example I'd like to draw on, which is that of Mary Seacole, who a few years ago received the commendation of having a magnificent and substantial statue unveiled in front of St. Thomas's Hospital. The people who were behind that campaign were very helpful to us in our campaign for Mary on the Green. And Mary Seacole, I think it's fair to say, please correct me if I'm wrong, is now the exemplar of a black historical woman that is accessible to the primary and secondary school curriculum. If children nowadays learn anything about black British history, it will be Mary Seacole. But, and this is my question, I understand that there was one of the first books, collections put out by the as it was then, the West Indian community in the perhaps late 1960s, early 1970s, was a sort of an attempt to do what you have flashed out tonight in collecting evidence of black British people or black people in British history. And it's my understanding that Mary Seacole was not part of that telling of history because she had disappeared at that point. And I wonder if you'd care to say anything about that way in which we forget someone who half a century later becomes an exemplar.
As you know, Mary Seacole supported wounded and inflicted British Army in the Crimean War. But it's also needs to be understood that she tried to join Florence Nightingale's nursing organisation, but she was rejected because she was basically not white. But it's also important to understand that Florence Nightingale is not just remembered as somebody, the Lady of the Lamp. She was also famous for her statistical work and finding out why so many soldiers were dying in the hospitals as well as in the battlefield. And it was her statistical work that gave rise to better medical treatment for British soldiers. That's what she's most famous for. It's good to know that for a long time, Mary Seacole had been a forgotten figure, but when soldiers had found out that she was living in penury, they got together and they raised funds for her so that she could kind of live in a better condition. And by the time she had passed away, when they came to her funeral, about 10,000 people had turned up at her funeral. It was the newspapers that reported it, so that's why. She didn't completely disappear, but I think her light had been eclipsed by Florence Nightingale. Basically had increased the healthcare of soldiers in the Crimean War when healthcare was absolutely appalling. I mean, British soldiers were lying in their own filth, they were lying on top of sewers, and it took her statistics to say, hey, wait a minute, we need to basically change the bed sheets, we need to remove dirty clothes, we've got to look after their wounds better, we've got to wash them down. And Mary Seacole was raised by her mother to be an apothecary. So this need for a scientific approach to medicine, military medicine, overshadowed the sort of the holistic medicine that Mary Seacole had in her treatment of British soldiers. And she had the same kind of traditions of cleanliness, looking after the soldiers' mental and physical health, opening up a hotel so that when the soldiers recovered, they could have a life away from the battlefield. You know, they were clean, they were treated better, so they both. But it was the empire's need to get better treatment for their soldiers in the expansion of their empires. Because remember, the Crimean War was a conflict between the British Empire and the Russian Empire, who were trying to expand into India, and the British Empire tried to stop them from expanding further into the West, as it were.
So you're saying that Florence Nightingale's work kind of supported the imperial project in a way that Mary Seacole's didn't?
Yeah.
What would you say to that, Ken?
I think that Mary Seacole, in a way, would be nuanced about this, would have supported the British project. But I think that there is a way in which racism both helps and undermines the project, and that Mary Seacole was marginalised by the racism, not so much of the soldiers, but of the establishment. And I think that what I wanted to mention was just this thing of remembering and forgetting, and how some people are forgotten. So just talking about medical people, this may seem totally unrelated, but I'm particularly fascinated by the Dr. James Barry, who was a major figure in the Victorian military. You may not have heard of him. The main thing that people know about Barry is that when he died, having been the top surgeon in the military, it was discovered that he was a woman who'd been living as a man throughout I'm going to say his life, because he called himself was living as a man. He was ridiculed, and Charles Dickens, for instance, wrote stuff ridiculing him. Now they look back and say he was the first doctor in the British Army who was able to carry out a caesarean and so on. It was actually a very important, and in terms of important about bringing hygiene to things as well. He had a big row with Florence Nightingale, but that's another story. But I think it's fascinating. They were ridiculed. More recently, people have said, actually, this was a really serious person. I'm fascinated by William Cuffay, who was one of the leading Chartists in London, who was black. I was reading a history of the Chartist movement from the 1970s, I think, which had him as a footnote and didn't mention he was black. At the time, when he was put on trial in the 1840s, he was on the front page of the Times, and the Times called the Chartist movement the first mass working class movement in the world, called it the Black Man and His Party, because they were trying to do it down. Why was he forgotten? I think there was an active attempt by people in authority. I mean, they transported him to Australia, but they asked us to forget him, and then he was forgotten. So it was only when you started getting a black radical movement in the 70s and 80s that people started saying, wasn't this guy important? And I think that that is something, it's that twin thing that happens a lot with people.
Sorry, Simon?
Yeah, just picking up on that and going back to Roberta's point. Forgetting is sometimes given a bit of a helping hand. I mean, my understanding with the Mary Seacole Memorial is that there were objections to it being erected from the Florence Nightingale Society, because they didn't want Florence Nightingale's memory to be deflected with another nurse in the Crimea. They failed, fortunately, but yeah, sometimes forgetting isn't a purely accidental thing. Sometimes we're meant to forget.
Very briefly, because we need to wrap up.
It's important to know that Mary Seacole was of Scottish descent. Her father was in the military. And it's also important to actually understand that the medicine that her mother had taught her was the same medicine that British people were using until the advent of modern science basically said, we don't want to know about foreign stuff, we got the science. We got the microscope, and the technology gave rise to the modernization, industrialization of medicine as well.
Thank you. We are out of time. I would just like to finish by saying a huge thank you to all our panellists. So Ken Alendi, David Walter and Simon Strickland Scott. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks, Joanna. Thank you very much. This was a very interesting discussion. So some of the biographies mentioned here is upstairs. Joanna Vassa, Ekano Olu, Mary Walters-Croft, Richard Price. And I would like to invite you upstairs to have some drinks, more drinks, and see our exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you.